Tax reform. President Trump sells the benefits of his new tax plan to the American people. Gun control. In the wake of the Las Vegas massacre, we get reaction from Catholic lawmaker Representative Mike Gallagher on the debate. Raging wildfires.
It's completely unrecognizable. It's like Mars.
Firefighters struggle to stop the flames spreading through California. And Pope Francis hits a milestone. How the Holy Father is connecting to his flock around the world. On EWTN News Nightly for Wednesday, October 11th, 2017. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for News from a Catholic Perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby in for Lauren Ashburn. At least 21 people are dead and thousands forced from their homes by wildfires raging across Northern California. Firefighters are putting up a valiant effort against the blaze, which have consumed some 115,000 acres.
Personally, I think it'll be one of the worst disasters in California history.
Wildfires consuming acre after acre in Northern California.
Never seen anything like it. The amount of resources we put into it, the amount of damage we've seen.
Most of the fires scorching forests and consuming homes were ignited Sunday, driven by dry conditions and strong winds. Thousands were forced from their homes with little more than the clothes on their backs.
They just left their house while it was burning down. They were just in their bathrobes. They just grabbed their car keys, left everything behind, got in their car, and just drove out.
Some have been able to return and begin picking up the pieces.
It's completely unrecognizable. It's like Mars.
But in some areas, wildfires are still pushing people from their homes.
There's live ashes that drop in. You can see right there. Time to go.
California will be receiving federal assistance. President Trump has signed a major disaster declaration and fire management assistance grants.
We're just trying to keep people alive. Number one priority is life.
The Bishop of Santa Rosa, California, says the wildfires burned Cardinal Newman High School and St. Rose Elementary, but spared most of the parishes in his diocese. Still, he's concerned about people living in the area. Bishop Robert Vasa releasing a statement saying, "My heart and prayers go out to all those displaced by the fire, especially those who have lost their homes. I am extremely grateful to all the caregivers who have reached out so generously to your brothers and sisters in need." He also asked for prayers. President Donald Trump is trying to refocus on his top legislative priority. He's using a Pennsylvania visit to pitch his tax overhaul, and he says truckers will benefit. White House correspondent Mark Irons joins us with more. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. The president will argue tonight in Harrisburg that his tax reform framework will help truckers by lowering their tax rates. The president has been traveling around the country trying to sell tax reform to Americans, but are Catholics buying it? President Trump is diving back into the tax fight, this time with truckers. Earlier this year, he invited a group of them to the White House.
No one knows America like truckers know America. You see it every day, and you see every hill, and you see every valley, and you see every pothole in our roads that have to be redone, right?
Now the president is pitching his tax overhaul as a boon for truckers. Trump wants to cut corporate tax rates from 35% to 20%, reduce the number of personal income tax brackets, and boost the standard deduction. And he says his plan would benefit truckers by lowering their tax rates and making it easier for families to pass their trucking business on to their children.
Any sort of tax system, any sort of tax reform, you have to keep the family and the human person at the center of it.
That's what Catholics should consider when reviewing the president's tax plan, says Robert Warren, an accounting professor at the Catholic University of America. He says one positive change is the proposal to raise the standard deduction.
That means that families would not have to pay taxes on their first $24,000 of income. It takes some of the lower income people off the roll so you don't have to worry about them, and hopefully it puts more income into the pocket of the family.
But Warren says Trump's plan ignores the tax gap, and it shouldn't be overlooked.
There's one big gap in Mr. Trump's plan, by the way, is that it doesn't address what we call the tax gap, which is the amount of money the IRS should be collecting but doesn't because of basically due to fraud.
Professor Warren says that due to fraud, the Treasury Department loses about $500 billion every year, which limits the ability to pay off national debt. Professor Warren says Catholic social teaching is clear. Government shouldn't burden additional generations with huge deficits. Wyatt?
Mark, with the push for tax reform, some pro-life groups are calling for a tax bill that would defund Planned Parenthood. What can you tell us about that?
Pro-life advocacy groups are looking to use any vehicle to defund Planned Parenthood. That effort
came up short in the failed health care bill. So now they want to include it in a tax reform bill, but that proposal is facing opposition from both Democrats and Republicans.
I'm sure it will be an uphill battle from there. Correspondent Mark Irons at the White House, thanks so much. President Trump welcomes Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to the Oval Office for talks focusing on the North American Free Trade Agreement. Trump repeated his view that he has been opposed to NAFTA for a long time and said he and Trudeau will, quote, see what happens. The Canadian leader calls his relationship with President Trump a good partnership. A lawmaker from South Korea says North Korean hackers have stolen highly classified U.S. war plans. It comes as the U.S. staged another show of force, flying 2 supersonic bombers over the region to participate in military drills with South Korea. President Trump met with his national security team yesterday to discuss North Korea's nuclear threat. Authorities in Las Vegas released a revised timeline of the recent massacre. Police now believe Stephen Paddock shot a hotel security guard through his hotel room door before killing 58 people at a concert. A spokesperson for the Mandalay Bay issued a statement disagreeing with the most recent timeline, saying, quote, what is currently being expressed may not be accurate. Joining us now is Congressman Mike Gallagher, a Republican from Wisconsin. Representative Gallagher served for 7 years in the United States Marine Corps and deployed twice to Iraq. Now he serves in the House Armed Services and Homeland Security Committees. So, Congressman, in wake of Las Vegas, Democrats are calling for greater gun control. In your view, is gun control the answer?
Well, it seems like every time we have a tragic incident like this, both sides immediately rush to their respective corners and talk about stances that they've already sort of formed beforehand, rather than having a reasoned and honest debate about what we can do. And that's why myself and a fellow veteran member of Congress have sent a letter suggesting that the ATF should look at this issue surrounding bump stocks. While details continue to be filled in surrounding Las Vegas, we know that the assailant used a bump stock to effectively turn a semi-automatic weapon into an automatic weapon. And as you know, automatic weapons are heavily regulated, and you have to go through a very deep background check in order to possess them. And we think it stands to reason that any piece of gear that turns a semi-automatic weapon into a fully automatic weapon should be regulated at least on the same pace as an automatic weapon. And I think that would be useful steps forward, even for strong pro-Second Amendment people like myself.
Just to expand a little bit on what you were saying, how do you sort of balance that, the Second Amendment as well as regulating things like bump stocks?
Sure. I mean, there's always been this tension, right? And even Justice Scalia has recognized that the Second Amendment is not unlimited. And a society as ours, we need to be vigilant about preserving the Second Amendment and people's rights to defend themselves. And when it comes to more regulation, I just ask myself, what is the practical impact of something like this? It may make us feel good in the moment, but would it have actually prevented a tragedy in this case? Now, with this particular incident, it seems particularly difficult because this guy, from what we know so far, did not fit any standard profile that might have caused him to pop up on the radar. But what we've seen in cases of domestic terrorism is that almost certainly, even when the media is claiming that it was a lone wolf attack, at some point the assailant did pop up on the radar of local or federal law enforcement, and for whatever reason he or she then fell off. Our local law enforcement officials, as well as our federal law enforcement officials, are doing the best they possibly can with constrained resources. And we need to think about, are we in Congress giving them, and at the state level, giving them the tools and resources they need to keep our communities safe?
Congressman, you yourself are Catholic. You've been open about your faith, especially on this program. How does your faith inform you in the work you do on Capitol Hill when dealing and thinking about issues like gun control that impact so many Americans?
Whenever something like this happens, all of us, believers and non-believers, are confronted with what theologians and philosophers have called the question of evil in this world. Put succinctly, if God exists, how could he possibly let evil like this happen? And for me, that question is resolved, as difficult as it is, in the person of Jesus Christ and in the power of the cross, which literally looks death and pain and suffering in the face and doesn't derive meaning from them, but robs them of their meaning and gives us an invitation into eternal life.
Sure, so many important Catholic ideas there, and we really appreciate your take on all of these issues. Congressman Mike Gallagher, Republican from Wisconsin, thanks so much for talking with us.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Lawmakers on Capitol Hill review international religious freedom, and advocates say lawmakers need to hold abusers accountable and keep them out of the United States.
They need to implement something called the Magnitsky Act. And what that means is people who violate human rights around the world should not be granted visas to come to the United States. Human rights violators should not be able to send their wives and sons and daughters to go to New York to shop for Christmas.
Christina Arriaga hopes Congress will raise awareness about religious freedom around the world. Pope Francis is expanding on his predecessor's opposition to the death penalty, the Holy Father saying today the practice goes against the gospel and the Catechism should find a way to express its message about the value of every human life. Francis made the remarks during a speech in the Vatican marking the 25th anniversary of the Catechism of the Catholic Church under Pope John Paul II. He said the death penalty violates the gospel and amounts to the voluntary killing of a human life, which is always sacred in the eyes of the Creator. According to the Catechism, the traditional teaching of the Church does not exclude recourse to the death penalty, but it also says cases when execution is absolutely necessary are very rare, if not practically non-existent. Our partners at Catholic News Agency are following the story and have a lot more. You can read their article at catholicnewsagency.com. A bishop in Indonesia resigns following reports he had a mistress and took more than $100,000 in church funds. The Vatican sent an investigator to look into the allegations after dozens of priests complained about Bishop Hubertus Letang. The results of the investigation have not been released, but Pope Francis accepted the bishop's resignation today. Next year's World Cup will not include the United States. That after the U.S. men's soccer team lost last night, a shock and surprise to many. The American squad was eliminated after losing to Trinidad and Tobago 2-1. Fans noted a lackluster effort that sparked calls for a change in the U.S. soccer system. The U.S. has made 7 straight World Cup appearances. The last time they did not qualify was 1986. Coming up, how Vatican II continues to impact the church 55 years later.
And I'm Jason Calvi at the Capitol. A push for independence. Nigerian Catholics tell me why they want their own country.
Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby in for Lauren Ashburn. You've heard of the independence movements in Catalonia and Scotland. Today, Nigerian Christians come to the United States Capitol to make their own declaration. Jason Calvi shares their story.
Nigerians living in the land of the free want another Independence Day.
We are not contesting Nigeria. We want to be Biafra, which we were.
50 years ago, Igbo people in southeastern Nigeria broke away from the country. They formed the Republic of Biafra. 1 million Nigerians died in the nearly 2.5-year civil war. Biafra surrendered in January 1970. But the ethnic troubles that led the group to leave Nigeria 50 years ago still rock the country today.
Stop killing my people. Stop the genocide.
So these Nigerians say it's time to bring back Biafra.
Aren't you concerned, Father, that there's going to be more war, more bloodshed if there really is a succession movement moving forward?
We're not asking for war, neither are we asking for anything that is against the law, but we're asking for a legal process, a referendum through self-determination, and we're calling on the international community, the United States government, the United Nations, to listen to our cry. It's the cry of an oppressed people.
This woman from North Carolina cries out for her family back home.
I have my brothers, I have my sisters, I have my nieces, nephews, cousins, aunts, uncles. Everybody I know is in Nigeria, and they are all suffering under this leadership of Muhammad Buhari. They are so afraid to come out. They are so afraid to live their life.
They hope one day to see the Biafra flag flying high once again.
All we are saying, give us Biafra.
Nigerian President Buhari is Muslim, while most Igbos are Catholic. The government just last month declared that the main Biafra separatist group is, in their words, a military terrorist organization. Why, this comes as Nigeria starts trials for more than 1,600 members of the Islamic terrorist group Boko Haram.
Wow, what an interesting story. Jason Calvi reporting from Capitol Hill. Thanks, Jason. It's been 30 years since Pope John Paul II brought together members of the Polish and Ukrainian churches to help heal their historic wounds. Major Archbishop Shevchuk of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church marked the occasion today in Rome. He spoke of the continued importance of promoting unity and reconciliation between Poland and Ukraine and throughout Europe.
And we are the active members, the active agents of this spiritual process movement of the construction of New Europe and movement of healing the wounds of our history.
As communism was crumbling, the late Polish pontiff tried to reconcile the faithful of both nations that suffered enormous losses of human lives at the hands of others during and after the Second World War. Today marks the 55th anniversary of the beginning of the Second Vatican Council in Rome. Pope St. John XXIII conveyed the council, which reshaped the Catholic Church. It clarified the truths of the gospel, sought new ways to express the meaning of Christ's incarnation and the meaning of our own lives. J.D. Flynn, the new editor-in-chief of Catholic News Agency, joins us now with more on this from Rome. So J.D., recap for us what happened at Vatican II and how did it impact the Church?
Well, Wyatt, that's a great question. John XXIII called Vatican II for a new reason in the Church. Usually a council is called because there's some doctrinal problem or dispute to be resolved. But the Pope called Vatican II because he said that the times were changing, the world was changing, and the Church needed to be able to articulate the message of the gospel, the message of Jesus Christ, the meaning of his incarnation, in a way that people in our world would be able to understand, in a way that would have meaning for them, in a way that would set them on fire for Christ. And so the Fathers of Vatican II got together here in Rome not to change anything, but to find new ways to proclaim the perennial teachings of the Church in ways that made sense to modern man and in ways that could encounter the modern world.
It's been 55 years since the Council. Why is this a significant anniversary?
This anniversary, the 55th anniversary, is the first significant anniversary in which the Pope was ordained after the Council, in which there are no active bishops who were ordained priests after the Council. And so, whereas up to this point we've been led by those who helped to form the Council, we're now being led by the priests and bishops and even a Holy Father who themselves were formed by the Council. So the Church is really beginning to see the fullness of the Second Vatican Council take effect and impact her life and ministry. Newman, Blessed John Henry Newman, said that water always runs clearer a little bit a little bit further away from its source, further from a spring. And so the further we get from the Second Vatican Council, the more clearly we can understand its meaning, and its impact on the life of the Church and the ways in which the Church can encounter the modern world with the message of the gospel.
Sure. You mentioned Pope Francis. You know, he highlighted one of the main themes of Vatican II today, the call to holiness. Tell us more about what he said.
Sure. Today, Pope Francis, in his Wednesday audience, talked about the fact that Christians, believers, Catholics find the hidden grace in their everyday life. They find the presence of God in their everyday life, and they find the ways that God is calling them to pour themselves out in love in their everyday life. He said that those who are close to Christ in their families, in their workplaces, in the places where God has put them, are able to carry the message of the gospel and the message of Christ into the world and transmit the Lord's love. What Pope Francis was talking about was the universal call to holiness. The Second Vatican Council said that every single one of us is called to become a saint, that being holy isn't just for priests or bishops or nuns in cloistered convents, but every single person is called to be a saint, to be close to Jesus Christ, and then to spread the love of Christ into the world. And that's what Pope Francis emphasized today.
Sure, such an important message and a great challenge as well for all of us to become saints. J.D. Flynn, Editor-in-Chief of Catholic News Agency, thanks so much for talking with us.
Thanks so much, Wyatt.
Up next, push for independence. We get reaction to the split threatening to unravel Spain. And going viral, Pope Francis reaches a new milestone in his push to reach people around the world. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby in for Lauren Ashburn. Spain's Prime Minister says the leader of Catalonia has until Monday to clarify whether he has declared his region's independence.
We are living one of the worst moment in the recent history of democracy.
Mariano Rajoy telling Spain's parliament it's unconstitutional. He's responding to a move by Catalonia's lawmakers who signed a declaration of independence, but they postponed action for several weeks to negotiate with Madrid. Joining us now via Skype from Barcelona is Lorenzo Dionis. Lorenzo, you were born and raised in Barcelona, the capital of the region of Catalonia. What is the mood there right now?
That's right, sir. The mood is a little weird at the moment. Nobody knows. There's a lot of uncertainty of what's going to happen. The people are divided from the families and friends. Some friends that I have, for instance, are pro-independence. Some others are against it, and that has a lot of a lot of fighting, a lot of arguments, and we tend to forget the love and friendship and families above what's happening in politics. So there's a weird vibe.
Well, Lorenzo, as you know, this issue isn't new. Some Catalans have been calling for independence for decades. Why do you think all of this has come to a head now at this point?
It all started a little bit with wanting the autonomy, financial autonomy, and because the Spanish government has always been quite firm in saying no against that, because that would mean that you need to modify the Spanish Constitution. Then there has been a growing movement and feeling. It's more of a passion thing than rational. Against the Spanish government, and now it's come to a point where people are very, very angry. So they just decided that they want the independence rather than just the financial autonomy or anything.
And speaking of people who feel passionate, about 40% of Catalans voted in the recent referendum, only about 40%. Most of them voted for independence, but can you give us an idea of what the other 60% of Catalans think?
Well, Wyatt, I want to start by answering that this referendum was actually illegal, and we don't really know that the facts are actually real. You know, there's a lot of confusion there. Everything's illegal, but I can tell you what the other 60%. It's what they call the silent majority. You probably have heard these terms lately, and these are Catalans who love Catalonia because Spain is a very diversified culturally, but they want to be part of Spain because that's the richness of the country.
So, but what do you think will happen? Right now, you mentioned there's a lot of uncertainty, but if you had to guess, what do you think?
Maybe in the future we might be looking at slight modifications in the Spanish Constitution, because this has been a growing problem not only in Catalonia but in the Basque Country as well. So maybe something that everybody can agree to, a little bit common, you know, in the common grounds of everybody.
Sure, it is such an interesting story, and interesting how things have been developing over the last several decades and come to a head at this point. And so we appreciate your breaking it down for us. Lorenzo Dionis of Barcelona, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Pope Francis is about to make an out-of-this-world call. He's scheduled to speak to the astronauts aboard the International Space Station on October 26th. This is the second time a pope has contacted astronauts in space. Pope Benedict XVI called the space station in 2011. And finally tonight, the Holy Father celebrates a social media milestone. His 9 Twitter accounts just surpassed a combined 40 million followers. The Pope uses the tweets to offer spiritual thoughts, reflections on events, and remember the saint of the day. One of the Pope's top tweets was posted last month. He said, "Dear young people, do not be afraid of the future. Dare to dream big. Keep joy alive. A young heart that has encountered the Lord." Such a positive message and a blessing as well. On that note, we want to thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We'll be back here tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless.